Hello and welcome to another edition of the Proselytize or Apostatize podcast. I'm here with our new co-host, David Paulman. What's up, David?
How you doing?
Good, man. So you're in a new role now. I mean, we went from Titus to you. Now you're going to be on here permanently and helping me host and stuff like that. And today we're going to you're going to jump right in basically, and you're going to be doing these doing a co-host, or you're going to actually host tonight and lead the conversation. What do you think about that?
I feel like I'm moving up in the world fast.
All right. Well, we got an interesting debate for you guys tonight, and I'm just going to let David take over and introduce our guest here today and everything.
All right, cool. So today we're having the question: is libertarian free will logical? A little bit of a background story on this. My friend Kyle here, he wrote an article recently which was defending libertarian free will, and it was posted on Inspiring Philosophy's website. So I posted this on my page, and I recommended it as a good article. And so me and Jacob had a little bit of back and forth already on libertarian free will, me being an Arminian and him being a Calvinist and all. So we had a little bit of back and forth on that. And so he told me to remind him to read it over the weekend. And so I did, and he read it, and I guess wasn't persuaded. And then anyway, so then Kyle got in the comments section, and I just thought, I'd love to see these guys debate this topic. And here we are. So our first guest, let me just introduce him. This will be Kyle Alander. He runs Christian Idealism, the YouTube channel there. So be sure to check that out. And then we have Jacob Brunton here. Well, before I introduce Jacob, let me just give you an opportunity to, say anything you want to add to that, Kyle?
No, everyone knows who I am, so not everyone, but I do run a YouTube channel. I'm growing in subscribers, and so one of my areas of focus is philosophy of mind and just general apologetics, so that's what I focus on. But free will definitely is one of my areas that I have done a lot of research on, so that's why I'm here tonight to discuss it. Yeah. By the way, can you hear my mic?
All right, and then we also have Jacob.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. All right, yeah, we've also got Jacob Brunton on here. He's the co-founder of For the New Christian Intellectual, which is a Christian worldview ministry. And Jacob, I'll let you add whatever you want to that.
Not much to add. I graduated with the MA in philosophy from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary just about 2 years ago now. Did a couple of my papers on this topic. I haven't published them on academia.edu yet, but maybe after this debate I'll polish them up and do so.
Awesome. All right. So then the format, this is we're going to have each of our speakers give a opening statement, about 12 to 15 minutes. And after that, it's just going to be free for all discussion, I guess, between the two of them. And me and Russell are just going to be here to make sure the conversation stays on track. If there's no objections, I thought it would be good to have Jacob open up with his opening statement first, since he's kind of providing the case against libertarian free will. Is that good with you guys?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
I'm cool with that.
All right, then proceed, Jacob.
All right, so I haven't really timed this out. I might end up being a little under the 15 minutes or 12 minutes what we're doing. That'll just save us some time for more discussion in the back end, which I think will be helpful. I want to start by saying that I generally object to the way that this debate is framed from the get-go. A lot of times, well, most of the time, the way that this debate is framed is in terms of libertarianism versus compatibilism. And the way that those two camps or positions are defined is whether or not free will is compatible with quote unquote determinism. So you've got incompatibilism, which is basically libertarianism, and then you've got compatibilism. And the reason I object to it, there's actually two reasons. One reason I object to that framing is that it seems odd to base an entire discussion about something about how it relates to something else. right? So if I want to talk about free will, why should I start with asking how does free will relate to something else that isn't free will? Shouldn't I start with just asking what is free will, and then once I have a good definition of it, then get around to asking the question, how does it relate to XYZ? So that's my first objection to the way that it's normally framed. My second objection is that the language of determinism often carries with it negative connotations, especially in regard to moral agency or moral value. It carries with it often very fatalistic connotations, even though there are technical differences between determinism and fatalism in philosophical literature. When you're talking just colloquially, there are heavy connotations of lessening the moral significance or the moral value of things when you talk about quote unquote determinism. And moreover, I see determinism as really sort of a subset of the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR, which is a big part of my position here. And so if I'm going to talk about the relationship between libertarian free will and anything, I'd want to talk about its relationship to the principle of sufficient reason, the PSR. But for those two reasons, especially the first reason, I prefer not to frame the debate in that way. And so I really don't call myself a compatibilist. I understand what that technically means, and that I technically would be classified as a compatibilist, but I don't want to accept the framework and thus the terminology up front, because I think it kind of boxes you unfairly into a rhetorical position that makes it a lot less defensible. So I want to start off by just saying, what is free will? What are we looking for when we're talking about free will? And I think that there are two major reasons that we come up with the concept of free will. The first is just that it seems obvious to us through introspection and just through living everyday life that we make choices. Like we have agency. We have the ability to choose to do X or choose to do Y. And so there's sort of this ostensible automatic concept of we're able to make choices, we're able to exercise a certain sense of freedom. And that's sort of the fundamental way that we come up with the concept of free will. But then beyond that, there's also the very strong intuition that moral agency or moral responsibility is dependent on us having genuine causal power to bring about a certain state of affairs, whether in ourselves or in the external world. And it seems unfair or unjust or irrational to assign moral significance to something in the absence of genuine causal powers. And so I think those are the two strongest reasons that we tend to come up with the concept of free will and kind of have it working in our everyday lives. And I think they're both legitimate. But notice, right off the bat, neither of those things in and of themselves says anything about determinism or PSR, right? You have to infer quite a bit in order to generate attention there. And I think that a lot of that automatically generated tension that we have in our culture, and a lot of the reason that it's often framed in the way that I described just a minute ago, is that the alternative to libertarian free will is assumed to be physical causal determinism, right? A materialistic view where everything is ultimately reducible down to the physical realm, or materialism, as we might call it. A sort of modern day naturalistic atheism is sort of the common view if you're not a Christian. And so it's assumed, real fast, I'm sorry, I hear some scratching. Is that me?
Yeah, I'm hearing it too, guys.
Sorry.
David,
should I keep going, or I don't want to ruin the audio?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
David,
You
I
were
think it's
fine
you.
from my end.
Okay.
Is it me?
All right, I'll keep going. Sorry. So I think a lot of the reason that we automatically jump to the idea that there is tension between the concept of free will, as I just laid it out, in terms of it being obvious and ostensible, and in terms of it being required for moral responsibility and moral value significance, is that we have this idea in our heads that if we're going to accept any version of the principle of sufficient reason, then it has to be physical causal determinism, right? And I agree that there are serious problems with physical causal determinism, and that if physical causal determinism were the case, then we could not have free will. We could not have the genuine, morally legitimate free will that we want to have if physical causal determinism was the case. And that's because there wouldn't be anything but physical mechanistic causation acting, and so there wouldn't be any room. Jaegwon Kim has a really good argument called the exclusion argument that you might be familiar with, Kyle, about basically arguing that if everything is materially caused or reducible to physical material causation, then there's no room left for any sort of agent causation. There's no room left for me as an agent to have any causal powers, because all the causal powers are sort of eaten up or consumed by the physical determinism. And so I agree that physical determinism rules out any sort of morally significant free will. But I don't think that physical determinism is the only possible way of thinking about the principle of sufficient reason when it comes to causation, right? So a lot of libertarian free will advocates, especially Christians, will argue against physical determinism and say, therefore, we need a view of agent causation. And agent causation is viewed by most people to be sort of the bastion of libertarian free will advocates. Because now you've got an agent who's over and above the physical causal realm, who's able to make a decision apart from the causal influence of the physical causal realm. And that's where I want to meet you there. I'm assuming that you're there, that you're not a physicalist, since you're a Christian. So I want to meet you there, but then I want to press forward and further and say there's still problems. There's still problems with libertarian free will once you get out of the physicalism realm. And the problem is, I mean, you've probably all heard various versions of this dilemma, but it's encapsulated in the dilemma of when you as an agent, a non-physically reducible agent, make a choice, a free, morally significant choice, why did you make that choice as opposed to some other choice? And your options are either you're going to have a sufficient causal explanation that's not physically reducible, but still sufficiently causal, or you're going to have to resort to some sort of randomness. And of course, you don't want to have randomness. Most libertarian free will advocates would say that randomness is just as delegitimizing of free will as quote-unquote determinism is, because then you still don't have the agent acting. It's sort of this random nothingness. And the way around it, by most advocates of LFW, is to posit that there is a reason for the action, right? So the agent has a reason for choosing to act with A as opposed to non-A. But then the question is, and we're just taking the dilemma a step further back now, question is, why did the agent go with reason A rather than reason B, which led to action A rather than to action B? And you see that this could go on, and you could end up having an infinite regress here if you don't come to a point of ultimately saying, all right, yes, there's a sufficient causal story behind the reason for the reason for the reason, or wherever you want to stop it at. And this is where the advocate of libertarian free will really ends up giving up on the principle of sufficient reason. And a good example of this is Alexander Pruss, who wrote the book on the principle of sufficient reason. But he himself is an advocate of libertarian free will, and he's got a whole chapter, or possibly multiple chapters, it's been a while since I read it, where he talks about the relationship between libertarian free will and the principle of sufficient reason. And he basically says, once he gets to this argument and he gets to this dilemma, and he acknowledges this is a dilemma for the advocate of libertarian free will. Once he gets to this point, he says, well, what we could do is we could modify the principle of sufficient reason to say that, well, we don't need sufficient causal explanation. We just need a sufficient explanation. And what he means by that is a good enough reason, right? So, and he basically says, well, we can just posit that reason A, that the fact that agent acted for reason A is rock bottom. It's just sufficient. We can just stop it there. And my objections are twofold. One, why stop it there? Why not stop it a step earlier and just say the agent didn't have to have any reasons at all? Right? The whole reason for positing a reason for the agent acting was to avoid the randomness argument or the randomness objection. And so really what Press is doing is just taking it one step back further and then saying, all right, well, we'll stop it there. And the question is, well, why didn't you just stop it and say we don't need a reason? It's just rock bottom. The agent acted for no reason at all, right? The second objection, and this is a little bit more substantial, is that if you don't have a sufficient causal explanation, then that doesn't seem to meet what we desire from the principle of sufficient reason to begin with in any other area of query. And I'm specifically limiting this discussion to causal sufficient reasons. So sufficient reasons in regard to causality, because you can talk about propositions and you can talk about modal logic and all kinds of other stuff that I don't want to derail the discussion. So I just want to focus in on causality here and say there's no other realm or area of life where we consider something as a sufficient causal explanation, meaning colloquially sufficient, as good enough, where there isn't actually sufficient causality happening, where the causal factors that we're citing don't mutually and sufficiently result in the outcome that is in question. And the only place that we do that, the only place that anybody wants to do that, is when it comes to free will. And in that sense, I say that that's sort of begging the question. It's a sort of special pleading where we're seeking robust, sufficient causal explanations for everything else in life, whether it's what caused a fire, what caused the airplane to crash, what allows an airplane to fly in the first place. All of these things, we're looking for sufficient causal explanations. It's only when we get around to free will that we say, oh, well, we don't need a sufficient causal explanation there. And so it seems like special pleading, it seems like question begging, and the only possible answers, if you're going to hold on to libertarian free will, are to just bite the bullet with the randomness objection, or to abandon the principle of sufficient reason altogether. And I don't think either of those are attractive options. And that brings us to the question, why should we want libertarian free will to begin with, right? If we can have robust, morally significant, free agent-caused action that's not physically, not reducible physically in a causal sense, and I think we can, and we can still have the principle of sufficient reason in respect to causality, then what does libertarian free will to bring to the table? Why should we feel this need to trade off between the principle of sufficient reason and libertarian free will? What does the libertarian conceive of when they think about the agent? What is the agent? Is the agent something over and above and separate from his reasons for acting, whether you're going to cite his beliefs, his desires, his psychological state, whatever the case is, whatever matrix of possible reasons you can come up with for the agent? It seems like the libertarian has to say that the agent is something over and above, not reducible to those reason state, those reasons, those possible reasons for acting. And if that's the case, then what is the agent? Is it just some random neutral void that doesn't have any reasons for the reasons that it chooses to act upon? So that's sort of the thrust of my argument and my objections to libertarian free will. And I think I will leave it there.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for that. Just a quick word of warning here. We got to mute our mics when our speakers are going. So just, I mean, we get a lot of background feed sometimes when that happens. Sorry about that, Jacob. Kyle, before you go, I'm going to let you take the floor here in a minute. I'm going to switch to speaker mode because I know you want to share your screen, and I want that in full screen for us here. All right. So go ahead, Kyle. You're good to go whenever, man. Your 15 minutes start now, or whenever you start your first word.
Okay. Do you guys see that? Oh, wait, hold on.
There
you guys see that presentation? Okay. Okay, so Israel, hold on. Let me get this. All right, so is free will logical? Well, first, we need to recognize that there are many different forms of libertarian free will. While I would agree with my opponent that there are some forms of libertarian free will that don't make sense because they fail to recognize external influence over our actions, I would disagree that libertarian free will is itself logically impossible. I accept that there is a limited sense of external influences, but that ultimately the agent makes the final decision. So then someone's character determines a range of choices rather than a specific choice itself. And so first line of evidence I want to give is simply our intuition. And I know he already discussed this before, but I just want to kind of bring as an argument is that intuition is a good starting point when addressing whether a position is correct. If something is intuitively obvious, then it is on the burden to show the intuition is wrong, not on the one to show the intuition is correct. And so free will is intuitive to how we make choices every day in our lives. As every day in our lives, it seems like we do have choices over our actions. And so free will is also simple in how we make choices. The claim that we are all the originator of our choices rather than something external to us is a much simpler explanation than a determinist view, which says that our choices are completely controlled by external causes. And so therefore, I would argue that the prior probability of free will is higher than that of determinism. And so determinism actually carries the higher burden of proof, at least initially. And so I would argue that my opponent would need to show evidence that can overturn this intuition of free will and not just assume that free will doesn't exist or isn't logical. So I also want to point out the second line of evidence is from the field of quantum physics. And so both the free will theorem and the Cauchy-Spector theorem show that because of quantum contextuality, that measurements of quantum observables cannot be simply be thought of as revealing what's called pre-existing or predetermined values. And so it says, quote, the free will theorem asserts roughly that if indeed we humans have free will, then elementary particles already have their own small share in this valuable cumulativity. More precisely, if the experimenter can freely choose the direction in which to orient his apparatus in a certain measurement, then the particle's response to that measurement is not determined by the entire previous history of the universe. And so the authors in that paper argue that the ascription of free will to elementary particles is deliberate, since the theorem asserts that if experimenters have a certain freedom, the particles have exactly the same kind of freedom. And so the authors also address the question of what's called randomness by saying that randomness does not apply to the free responses of the particles they described. It is precisely what they call semi-free nature of twinned particles and more generally of entanglement that shows that something very different from classical stoicism is at play here. It also enables them to agree with Einstein that his famous quote, which is that God does not play dice with the universe. Therefore, since quantum physics is a non-deterministic theory, and since it supersedes all the classical physics, and since classical physics is a deterministic theory, then there is no evidence for determinism from the field of physics. Rather, it's more likely that physics can explain free will, and therefore free will would be logical in this sense. And so it would mean that the agent's first cause would be the particles collapsing into a different state to start off a chain of events that initially started with the agent's choice. That would be what we call agent causation. The constant observer would play a key role in wave function collapse and would be able to allow for agent causation in the universe. Again, I already pointed out before. I should note, however, that this does not prove that free will exists, since we can't really prove free will in the strong sense, because we can't we can't get outside our experiences to see if there's something external to us that is really causing our decisions. Rather, this shows that free will is, again, logical and can be explained with modern physics. The third line of evidence I want to point out is from neuroscience. It reaches studies into deliberate decision making. For many years, I just want to point this out very quickly here. So, in many years in the past, there have been what's called the Libet experiments, and its methodology was used by many scientists, and they concluded that free will was an illusion because they were able to predict someone's decision a full 10 seconds before they constantly made a decision. However, they didn't take into account that there are different neurological mechanisms in decision making. And so because of that, they found that deliberate decision processes are not deterministic. And so we can see how free will is at least compatible and even supported by neuroscience. And so just to kind of wrap up here, in case anyone brings up this objection, researchers found that the raised potential is in the brain is present even when subjects were not making any decisions. And then also that researchers also found that there is a veto in the raised potential that can stop a decision from being carried out. And finally, researchers found that the raised potential is absent during deliberate decision making. So I just want to point those things out just to kind of respond to any Libet type arguments that get brought up. So the methodology used by Libet and other researchers that tested human decision making were all based on arbitrary decisions and not deliberate ones. And so deliberate decisions are being currently studied by neuroscience. So I want to make a distinction between what's called free will and what's called meta-free will or criteria causation. So criteria is the reasons or reasoning of our choices, which is the weighting of values, of goals, and past outcomes that our brain uses in order to choose for future outcomes. So during deliberation, the brain will test the various options, producing a pathway of events along with that choice, much like an what's called imaginary world line. And so new criteria will lie along these optional future paths or navigations. So this happens when you imagine something. So like it could be like imagining what meal you might taste, comparing the satisfaction levels of different similar past meals, or trying to imagine like who you're like, if you were to marry this person, what would life with them be like? That's basically what's called different navigations. And so when this happens, this set of various paths being tested and predicted in memory, because this is all going on in our brains, right, are called a cognitive phase space, as the agent chooses a particular path, a particular set of criteria that will be gathered from whatever they choose. And so if the mind rejects some paths, they can, some particular criteria will not be obtained if they reject some paths. However, if the agent chooses a path due to the criteria that can be gathered, the agent is now what is called cultivating criteria. And so cultivating criteria, again, would be what I call meta-free will. And so just to give you a little quote from Peter Ticey, he says, quote, "Finally, it is not enough to simply have the first order free will afforded by the above kind of nervous system that can choose from action freely, only if present choices can ultimately lead to a chooser becoming a new kind of chooser. That is, only if there is a second order free will or meta-free will do brains have the capacity to both have chosen otherwise and to have meta-chosen otherwise. Only such a meta-free will allow a brain not only to choose among options available now, but to cultivate and create new types of options for itself in the future that are not presently open to it. Only then can there be responsibility for having chosen to become a certain kind of person who chooses from among actions consistent with that kind of person." And so just to kind of summarize what he's trying to say here, he's basically saying that the brain is preparing future states during which new criteria is the goal of the choice, and the chooser is what's called choosing what kind of chooser he wishes to become. And so I also want to point out a very important distinction here. So there's a distinction between what I call independent determinism and dependent determinism. So independent determinism is basically like the natural laws of nature, things that are like basically outside of control, right? Dependent determinism, however, is what's called criteria causation, which is when the independent forces are exploited for informational or criteria causation. So I'm going to get more into this in a moment. So just to give you a little analogy to compare these two ideas. So independence would be like water falling down rocks, right? That's pretty much it. Like nothing else to me to be explained. Dependent would be as if there's certain filters that are being placed on the water to kind of filter or guide where the rocks are going to go. And so again, this is just an analogy. This isn't a perfect analogy, but this is the best way I can describe it. And so this is what happens in the human brain, is that changes in the physical system's criteria, consciousness, limits firing in light of what must be met by future inputs to continue on falling down these rocks. Again, going back to the analogy, but are guided by criteria. And so this process of criteria causation is what's going on in our brains like constantly, and this is what's called a top-down operation. And so it allows animals not only to consider possible courses of present action or type 1 free will, but also, at least in the case of humans, it allows us to consider what kinds of choosers we strive to become, or type 2 libertarian free will, or meta free will. And so I also want to point out that explanations are not just the actual, the executed, but also the possible, the deliberated, but both are actually part of the will. And so we do not have a will, rather we have what's called wills. Thus, one might restrict the PSR to only actual infinity entities. However, I would also include possibilities as well. So ultimately, free will is completely logical if you approach it from this top-down microscopic perspective, which is basically the brain using this kind of phase space to test the long-term future tense pathways. And so in this model, and again, this model is Peter Tice's model of free will, and he's a physicalist, so he doesn't believe in a soul or anything like that. So he's a full-on physicalist. And this is the model he points out. And he says that in such a model, neither natural forces, the linear philosophy of causation, or the unrestricted PSR is a potential rebuttal. And so just to kind of summarize, I went over intuition and simplicity. Quantum physics shows that free will is logical. And finally, criteria causation and recent neuroscience is showing that free will is logical. And so the burden is to show that all these things are mistaken and that somehow, despite this evidence, free will doesn't exist or isn't logical. So I define free will like this. Free will is simply the ability over time for an individual to navigate to a type of chooser as a top-down operation. And so I would say that that is completely logical. And so that will be my closing statement. Thank you. Okay.
All right. So Kyle, you said that was the end of your opening statement there?
Sorry.
All right. So then, yeah, that's fine. At this point, then I think I'll just open it up. Then I guess we'll start with Jacob. You can, lob any questions.
If you have any questions, yeah, I know it was very confusing. I was like, when I was trying to read, I was like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. But so, do you have any questions? Like, because
you're still muted, Jacob.
Thank you. First of all, I'm surprised that he's a physicalist. I'm curious, are you familiar with Kim's arguments?
Oh yeah, well that's the thing. Like, Peter Tice was the one that actually responded to Kim's argument. There's actually a paper called "Two Types of Libertarian Free Will in the Brain." And you can look it up. And Peter Tice responds to Kim's argument. And he uses this sort of criteria causation to basically refute the the exclusion argument, and basically shows that even under a physicalist model, when you take into account this criteria causation, that free will is still preserved. Like, you can still have free will even under physicalism. It's not reductionism per se. It's a non-reductionist form of physicalism, but you could still have free will under physicalism. So.
Interesting. So I think my major objection, and this again goes to the framing of the whole debate, is sort of the smuggling in of libertarianism into the concept of free will. And it's sort of a lot of the discussion assumes that if it's not libertarian, therefore it's not free will. And so, you're just using the phrase free will and assuming libertarianism there. And a lot of that is packed in when we talk about intuitions and things like that. And when we talk about burden of proof. So I agree that there's a very strong and good intuition that we have free will. I'm not so sure about an intuition of libertarian free will, because that would have to be the intuition that my free will choices lack sufficient causation. not just that they lack sufficient physical causation, because I could even see that as a sort of intuition, but that they lack any sort of sufficient causation, physical or non-physical, and that's a whole lot to pack into an intuition that I'm just not sure that I have or that anyone else has.
Well, it depends on. So I would actually. It depends because again. I said there are different forms of libertarian free will, right? So I don't actually accept what's called hard determinism, which is the view that like we are completely free from all external influences. Like I reject that. Like I would agree with you there. Like that form of libertarian free will is definitely ad hoc, not true at all. However, I think if you define it a certain way that takes into account external influences, I think once you accept the fact that the agent is the ultimate decider in his decision, then that pretty much is libertarian free will. It may not be the hard form of it. It's more like the soft version, obviously, but that's still gonna like allow libertarian free will to at least be logically possible, and I think it does exist as well.
Sure. And that's why I stress the issue of sufficient causality, because any good libertarian who doesn't want to just be pilloried right off the front is going to say, well, yes, there's room for external causal factors, right? External influences and things like that they're going to concede that, and I think rightfully so. But the caveat is that there's no sufficient causal determinism, quote unquote, or sufficient causation to an agent's actions. And that's really where the difference lies. Is there a sufficient causal explanation, or isn't there a sufficient causal explanation? And libertarianism obviously has to say there is not a sufficient causal explanation. And the first thing that I'm just objecting to is that doesn't seem like the type of thing that we can have an intuition about.
Well, I think I would agree with you if it was only type 1 free will. But when you take into account type 2 free will, which is criteria causation, that objection doesn't really work, because the different possibilities that the brain is deciding, that's still a sufficient like explanation, right? Because it's going on in this cognitive phase space like I was talking about earlier. So you're still gonna, it's not type 1 free will, but it's definitely type 2 free will, and that could still, I would say that the PSR could still apply and still work with type 2 free will. And like type 1 is kind of like the consequence of type 2. So it's kind of like, is what it is.
So when you say type 2 free will and you're talking about the brain operating in the way that you are, what you're suggesting, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, what you're suggesting is basically that there's a process, and we don't need to get into the technical difficulties unless you think it's relevant, that there's a process that the brain is going through. And
obviously,
and the type 1 libertarian free will is a result of that process.
Well, right. Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, so type 1 is like the micro free will, and then the macro free will is type 2 free will. So it's like type 1 free will they both influence each other in some way, right? But type 1 free will is what goes on in our everyday lives, whereas type 2 is kind of like our character, our desires, our needs, our wants, right? And those will obviously have an influence on type 1 free will. But again, we still, the point I'm trying to make here is they both affect each other. So when you make a decision, you're what's called cultivating criteria, or you're kind of creating your own meta free will or macro free will, so that will pretty much kind of navigate to your micro free will or your everyday decisions. So I think once you take both those things into account, then I don't really see any contradiction with the PSR at all. I mean, that's just my opinion. You might disagree with me there, but
so I think it'd be helpful to try to zero in as much as possible on where we agree and where we disagree.
Okay.
So I can fully agree that there's a distinction between sort of what you're calling type 1 free will and type 2 free will in terms of our everyday actions, and you might just call the agent does action A, that's sort of type 1 free will, and then there's the history of his actions and the history of his thought life and his desires and all this matrix of things, and that's sort of the type 2, and that they influence each other, right? That the action that you take can sort of solidify a certain character trait in you that will sort of limit the range of options for your next set of choices down the road. So I can agree with all that. Where we disagree is on the question of sufficient causation and all of that. So sufficient causation means for the word sufficient means can't do otherwise, all things being equal. So take an agent at any given stage in that whole process, whatever you want to talk about, whatever influences you want to throw in, whatever history you want to throw in, take a snapshot of the agent, and at that moment, all things equal, the question is, can he do or do otherwise, right? Can he choose A or non-A, all things being equal? And if the answer is yes, then we don't have sufficient causation.
Okay, so your main objection has to do with whether or not we could do otherwise, right?
Yes.
Okay, so for there, I would just to kind of respond to that, I would say I know Peter Tice, he makes a distinction between the possible paths and in the actual paths. So the actual paths are the paths that we have that we kind of already chose, right? But then the possible paths in our decisions are what we are constantly thinking about, and that would be I would say that would be sufficient, especially if there's this sort of, again, you can go back, I guess we can discuss infinite regress problem because I mean, I think we would both agree that in order for something to be sufficient, there can't be an infinite regress because it's not sufficient, right? So I would say it just kind of boils down to the infinite regress problem. And if we're talking about infinite regress, I mean, that doesn't really, the infinite regress problem doesn't really apply to that under meta free will because, again, it's a whole history. So there's a point in time in which that meta free will kind of start, and that starts off early in life, right, when you're a toddler, and then you grow it over time. So I would say the whole meta free will is sufficient, and from that you can then sufficiently get this micro free will or type 1 free will to make everyday decisions.
I see. So I'm somewhat familiar with this line of reasoning. I don't think that the way I've encountered it uses the same technical language that you're using, but it seems like what you're saying is, me as an agent right now, there is sufficient causation for my actions given the sort of character and psychology that I've built up over the course of my life.
Right.
But at one point in time in the past, there was an instance where there wasn't sufficient causation.
Well, yeah, so I would say that, I guess, that would have to be where does exactly free will kind of start, and I'm talking meta free will here. So
yeah,
I think that would have to do with any prior conditions that we were born with. Like, I mean, there are, like, for example, there are certain fears that we have that we are kind of born with, like that we don't really have a choice in. So I think that would have to go into like evolutionary psychology, not evolution, but like just psychology in general, like child development, right?
Yeah,
so,
I don't think we need to describe the causes, right? It's really just a matter of are the causes there, and are they sufficient or not? Well, regardless of what they are, like I don't expect you to be able to paint a picture, especially an accurate picture, right, of your own psychological history or the hypothetical psychological history of a given agent. That's a huge burden I don't want to place on either of us.
Right.
I just want to talk about, is there sufficient causation at every step along the way, or isn't there?
I think,
and it sounds like what you're saying is that there has to be some step near the beginning of life where there isn't sufficient causation, and then maybe there is sufficient causation from then on. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, because I believe that, like, I take the view that like free will is kind of developed over time. Like, we need, in order for us to have free will, we need information given to us. Because I mean, if we don't have information given to us, of course we can't have free will, right? Because there's no options to choose from. So we have to be given information in order to make the right choice, so that whatever choices we make early in life will kind of develop our character and will create this meta free will that kind of builds over time. And so I I don't really see how that wouldn't be a sufficient explanation of free will when you look at it from this, macro free will perspective. I mean,
I agree that viewpoint is a lot more plausible than sort of the run of the mill Joe Schmo libertarian free will.
Oh yeah.
But I think it still falls prey to the objection of violating the principles of sufficient reason, because it has to allow for some lack of sufficient causation somewhere in the timeline. It's just in the past, in each agent's past, but it still has to allow for a lapse in sufficient causation somewhere along the way, even if it's just once for a split second.
So, hold on. I'm trying to look at my notes here. So, to kind of address that, I think the question is, do we ourselves start to make that choice? I would say yes and no. That there's this prior condition, like we had to be created, right? Somehow, some way, we had to be created, and so that creation of that free will itself be sufficient, and then the free will itself becomes sufficient from that. So I think that would kind of I don't know, because it gets very complicated, because again, I don't know when exactly free will starts. I mean, it could be different from any human being, because certain people will develop different, have different psychologies and so on and so forth. So I would say from there, the question isn't what started free will. The question is what created free will. And so I guess we'd have to go to, is the creation of free will, when it first starts in early life, is that sufficient? Right?
Yeah.
You get where I'm going at?
Question. Yeah. I mean, I still disagree that gets you out of the objection, but I don't want to keep drilling the same point. Here's an interesting question that might help some more dialogue. And I mean, David, either David, feel free to jump in whenever that you think is appropriate here. I'm curious, do you think that God has libertarian free will? And if so, is it sort of the same model where, like, there was a time in the past where his choices weren't sufficiently caused, but now they are sufficiently caused?
I think God does have free will, but it's because he's timeless, because he's eternal. There wasn't any development that happened. I mean, it's the same. I kind of compare like free will with our knowledge of the world, right? So God's omniscient, right? We're not omniscient. We don't know everything. So we have a limited number of options to choose from, whereas God does have like probably an infinite amount of options to choose from. And so from his infinite knowledge and his, infinite free will, I guess you could say, that is itself sufficient. Like he is just, I guess you could say it's like it's a part of his nature to be sufficient, self-sufficient in that sort of way. So I'd say that his free will is itself self-sufficient. And that's why like he can make that's why like he's able to like make choices, right? He's able to have type 1 free will, but then he also has this type 2 free will from his character that kind of eternally existed. That's always kind of existed within his nature. So that's how I would kind of answer that question.
Well, see, that seems really similar to the way that I would answer the question, and because I would answer it that way, I would conclude he does not have libertarian free will.
Oh, okay.
because his character sufficiently brings about his choice or his action, right? To say that he doesn't have, or to say that he does have libertarian free will would seem to indicate that his character does not sufficiently bring about a given choice or action that he makes. That there's something else,
right?
I
would agree. I would actually agree with you if we only had type 1 free will. So if we only had type 1 free will, I mean, if we had like no desires, no needs or wants, like I think free will would be pretty much illogical if that were the case. But I don't think we have. I think there's two types of free will, like I said before.
But the question is the whole matrix of those needs and wants sufficiently causing the choices that you make or not? And if not, then there's not sufficient causation, or something's coming in from the outside to complete the sufficient causation. and we obviously don't want to say that about God, that because
Right.
there's nothing outside of him that would come in to sufficiently cause his action. And so you've either got God, because we don't have this issue of time, so it's less obscure with God. He's timeless, so it's kind of in your face that it's either his character sufficiently causes his actions such that he, quote unquote, could not do otherwise given his character, or you've got a sort of randomness problem where God isn't acting fully on his character, because otherwise you'd have sufficient causation. You've got him having an element of randomness where his character only gives him so much range of options, and then he randomly chooses within that range of options.
So I would say, to respond to that, I would say that because criteria causation is goal oriented, then God has certain goals in mind when making decisions. So the I guess you could say like the mind of God would kind of like prepare future states or future possible worlds, you could say, that are themselves self-sufficient, right? And again, this is all, I think this is like kind of all assuming the unrestricted PSR, and I think we don't have to hold to the unrestricted PSR. I think there could be a restricted PSR which kind of gets around this whole issue. I guess, I don't want to spend too much time on that aspect, but
well, my question to that is there some other reason to restrict the PSR in terms of causation other than this issue of libertarian free will? Because if there's not some independent reason for positing a restriction on it, then it really seems like it's sort of special pleading and question baking. Like, well, we run into problems with the unrestricted PSR on this issue, so let's just go ahead and restrict it.
Yeah, so I would say I do hold to the restricted PSR myself, because I don't really see, because sufficiency, it really depends on how you define it. Do you mean like, are you talking like the sufficient explanation for like it has to be fully explainable like every conceivable way, or?
So when I'm talking about sufficient causation, what I mean is that for any phenomenon that we're seeking a causal explanation for, there is a sufficient causal explanation, meaning that there's a sufficient matrix of factors that necessarily entail that phenomenon and no other phenomenon. That's what sufficient means,
Okay,
right?
okay.
We talk about something as logically sufficient for X. We mean, given those factors, X follows.
Right. So again, I would kind of go back to Peter Ticey on this. So there's what's called possible sufficient reasons and then actual sufficient reasons. So the possible sufficient reasons, again, would be the navigating in our minds, kind of navigating towards what we want to choose, and then the actual is what we actually do choose, and they're both sufficient because we both thought about it, the possibilities, and then we played out the possibilities. So I would just kind of go back to the
all right. So I'm just
sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So just to break this down a little bit to make it understandable for the stupid people like me. What I'm seeing here is basically, I feel like so the basic disagreement seems to be over the principle of alternative possibilities, right? This ability to do otherwise. And so it seems like Jacob, you're saying that that doesn't exist within an unrestricted principle of sufficient reason. And sorry, Kyle, I didn't know if you were saying
No, it's fine.
that it can exist with an unrestricted one, or that we have to have a restricted one.
Yeah,
I know. I had a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I know Ticey, he actually holds to the unrestricted PSR. So I just want to make that clear. But
Okay, so you think
yeah.
you think that you can hold to an unrestricted principle of sufficient reason and still have a principle of alternative possibilities?
Yeah, you can have. Yeah, you won't be able to, like, you couldn't have hard libertarian free will under it, but you could have what's my version, which is soft libertarianism, which is accepts that our desires will be sufficient in influencing our choices. So yeah.
Right.
Also, I'm gonna
what about? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
All I'm gonna say is that you guys went really deep here. Yeah, I'm enjoying this, man. I'm loving it, man. This is awesome. But I'm gonna be laughing if we all get up there one day and then God's like, dude, was so much more simpler. And, what I mean? I'm just gonna crack up, man. But I think one of my biggest things is wrestling with like dealing with an omniscient being. I think that's a big one for me. But go ahead, David. I mean, take it away, man. You guys are doing great. I love it.
No, I just wanted to ask, so there's a lot of talk that I hear about that you can actually have libertarian free will without a principle of alternative possibilities. So you can actually have libertarian free will without the ability to do otherwise. So, I don't know if that's, too far off base here, but it seemed like bringing that up would be relevant. I was curious, well, first of all, Kyle, if you think that that's, a legitimate possibility in a way maybe of getting around Jacob's objection, and then I'm curious if Jacob has, an answer to if he thinks that doesn't escape it.
Well, actually, the share screen. Sorry. So I quoted this, and what he actually does say is that that is only if there is a second order free will or meta free will do brains have the capacity to both have chosen otherwise and to have meta chosen otherwise. Only such a meta free will allows a brain not only to choose among options available now, but to cultivate and create new types of options for itself in the future that are not presently open to it. Only then can there be a responsibility for having chosen to become a certain kind of person. I know Peter Ticey, he does hold to the principle of alternative possibilities, and he holds to it because of this meta free will. So I just, I want to get your thoughts on this, Jacob, because there's a lot of neuroscience that is kind of pointing in this direction of like different neurons acting different ways, and certain decisions you can make can actually alter like your neurochemistry, and like that will inevitably kind of like build up your criteria.
Yeah, so let me speak real quickly to David's question about principal alternative possibilities, which in my seminary degree, the professors would always just say PAP, and I'd always be like, I'm anti-PAP. There's actually an advocate of libertarian free will named Kevin Timpe, who did a really good analysis of all of the recent attempts to have libertarian free will without the PAP, without the principle of alternative possibilities. And he analyzes each of their strongest arguments, and he concludes, and I think rightly so, and again, he advocates for libertarian free will, but he concludes that they all actually do rely on an implicit principle of alternative possibilities. They just sort of cover it up. And the reason they're doing it is to get around the Frankfurt objections. And I don't want to go too far off topic, but that there were some sort of highly technical objections called the Frankfurt objections to the principle of alternative possibilities. They didn't really have anything to do with the principle of sufficient reason. They were sort of like Gettier examples. That they were sort of like little philosophy tricks that set up these conundrums, and everybody started trying to abandon the principle of alternative possibilities because of those sort of tricks. And what most of them ended up turning to was something very similar to what Kyle's talking about here, where you basically have a more robust view of what libertarianism is, in the sense of, yeah, sure, right now, as a mature agent, I don't have alternative possible. I don't have the ability to do otherwise in the fullest sense of the term right now.
Right. You have it within meta free will, right?
Yeah, but they would say at some point in my past I did, and that's what Kevin Timpe gets to, and I think he's right, because that's just what libertarian free will is. If you don't have the principle of alternative possibilities somewhere along the line, it doesn't have to be right now. It can be just somewhere, just once for a split second in the agent's past. If you don't have that at least, then you lose what you're trying to get in libertarian free will, and I think he's right about that. Now, to get to Kyle's question about interacting with Peter, how do you say his last name? I'm sorry.
Peter Ticey.
Ticey. So I'm attempting, per David Russell's request here, I'm attempting to keep this simple by not getting too much into the specific details of either the neuroscience or the psychology or whatever else, because I don't think that it actually matters in the end. The issue is, at any given point, wherever we're drawing the line at, when we're talking about the origins of free will, whether it's 10 seconds ago or at birth or somewhere in between, the question is, at that point, was there sufficient causation for the following action, or wasn't there? And if there wasn't, then we don't have PSR. And I mean, it doesn't matter if we break it down in terms of neuroscience, or we break it down in terms of past psychology, or we break it down in however you want to break it down. And there's probably lots of really good, legitimate ways to break it down. And I can agree with the fact that we influence our own character in certain ways, and that there's all kinds of neuropsychology things that are going on that influence our character and ultimately influence our decisions. At the end of the day, bottom line, all I want to know in terms of this discussion is, was there always sufficient causation, or wasn't there? Was there ever a point where there was not sufficient causation, where what preceded the action necessarily results in the action?
Well, Jacob, I don't know, but Jesus says that, let your yeses be yeses and your noes be noes. So obviously there's choice there. All right.
That's right.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, go ahead, guys. I just have to jump in there a little bit.
Yeah. So, again, I think, Peter Ticey does hold to the unrestricted PSR. I'm not sure if he specifically addresses the PSR he just focuses mostly on the neuroscience aspect and the philosophy mind aspect. He doesn't really get into the philosophy causation or anything like that. But I do know that he does accept that there can be sufficient explanations if we make a distinction between the possible paths and the actual paths that we make. So the possible paths kind of again, are just psychology and, whatever it is, what it is. So yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know. I don't want to be talking past each other, because at this point I feel like we're talking past each other.
Sure. Well, I think what's going on is what he is doing is he's sort of making the same move that Alexander Pruss does, where he's sort of saying there's a sufficient explanation here, and by sufficient what he means is it's reasonable, or it's enough for me. This explains it for me. I don't have any more questions. Right. And that's not quite what I'm talking about when I talk about sufficient causation. I'm looking for the causal factors that precede it necessarily entail the action as a result. And so that's where we might be talking past each other, yeah. and it's probably just good for us to understand that those are the differences that we're talking about.
I want to also make something clear. I don't think any libertarian actually denies determinism in the broad sense. What I mean by that is determinism in the sense that things are determined, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone denies that. I think the only disagreement is whether or not the agent it gets to play a role in that, in the determinism. That's why it's called agent causation, or I guess you could call agent determinism or whatever. And so everyone agrees that determinism is somewhat true in the sense of things are determined, cause and effect. The question is whether or not the agent has a sort of role to play in the world, sort of a role to play that. And so, again, I would just go back to my criteria causation model, because obviously free will decisions are much more complicated than just A plus B equals C. It's very, very complicated. And honestly, if I'm gonna be honest with you, I feel like it's intuitive that free will exists, but I think explaining it is much more difficult, because there's just so much that just go into everyday decisions that I honestly don't really see, even with neuroscience, I don't really see how that's going to really solve what's called the problem of free will. I think we just have to go back to intuition. Like, yeah, we might not be able to fully.
All right, guys.
But yeah, sorry.
Yep.
Finish
No,
up,
you're fine. We're going to be wrapping up here in just a minute, so I will give you. I actually have a question I want to put to both of you, and then I'll give you both a final word. If you were done, Kyle, I don't.
No, I'm good. Yeah, I pretty much got everything I need to say. So.
All right, yeah. So we are going to be wrapping this up. Yeah. So just first of all, and I know we haven't had any discussion on this because this isn't strictly speaking the topic of the discussion or of the debate tonight. But I was curious, to hear both of what you had to say on the issue of God and foreknowledge. I'm curious, like, I'm obviously, Kyle, you would hold that it's compatible for God to, have foreknowledge and us have free will. And then I'm curious if Jacob, thinks that that's acceptable. So So I guess I'll do it this way. I'll have Jacob first. You answer what your thoughts are on foreknowledge and free will, and then just whatever your concluding thoughts are on this. Then same to Kyle. Thoughts on that question, and then concluding statements, and we'll wrap up.
All right. Well, I need to confess that I'm a little taken off guard by the question posed to me, because typically foreknowledge isn't really an issue unless we're talking about libertarian free will. So I don't affirm libertarian free will, and therefore I don't see any conflict between God having perfect foreknowledge and human free will, because I don't think that human free will has to be of the libertarian variety. I don't think it has to lack sufficient causation. And so the idea of God's foreknowledge and human free will, in my mind, are perfectly compatible. I don't know, David, did you have some more pointed question in regard to my position on that I'm not really catching? You're muted.
Forgot that. All right. I know. Yeah, I was just curious if you did think that was an issue or not. Yeah, and then sorry, and then just any concluding thoughts you have or what you want to say.
Oh, sure. So concluding thoughts. I think I would just re-emphasize that I agree that. What is that? There we go. Okay. I agree that there is a strong intuition that we have free will. I question whether that intuition includes libertarian free will, especially when you understand that libertarian free will means free will which lacks any sufficient causation at any point in time, right? So when we say, I have an intuition that libertarian free will is true, what we're really saying is I've got an intuition that my free choices lack sufficient causation in the entire history of my life. That I've got intuition that there's some point in my life, in my past history, where sufficient causation didn't happen. And that, I would argue, isn't so intuitive, right? And so we have to be careful not to automatically conflate free will per se with libertarian free will, which is highly specific. In addition to that, I would just say I agree with agent causation. The question is, what is the agent, and is the agent's will ever free from the agent himself, right? So I would just say the agent is, qua agent, as actor, he is just the sum total of his reason states, of his beliefs, his desires, his character, his psychology, whatever else you want to throw in there. As an agent, the agent just is the sum total of those things, and he must act in concert with those things, and he can't ever act contrary to those things. And that just makes total sense to me. And so I don't think that you have to be a libertarian about free will in order to have agent causation. In fact, I think libertarianism brings in the question of randomness in addition to the question of how does this fit with the idea of sufficient causation, which most people, I would say, is intuitive to most people. The idea that everything has a sufficient cause for it is an intuitive thing, and the fact that we have free choice is an intuitive thing. Why can't we just take those two intuitions and put them together? Why do we have to bring in this extra super complicated thing called libertarianism, where we have to say, no, at some point in time there wasn't sufficient causation?
All right, and then Kyle, just your thoughts on foreknowledge and free will and your concluding thoughts.
Okay. So I actually used to be a Molinist, but now I'm like kind of undecided. I'm like between Molinism and Arminianism. So one of my issues with it has to do with like possible world semantics, and I think that any view that accepts meticulous providence, I think that's going to run into what's called the problem of evil. I think if you're going to say that God predetermined evil to take place, that's going to have some serious consequences. And so I've been looking more into it. So I do accept mental knowledge, but I'm still kind of like undecided on that. I still need to do more research on that, but I definitely do think that free will is compatible with divine foreknowledge. So yeah. And then as far as my closing thoughts, again, I would just go back to making my distinction between free will and meta free will, and understanding that libertarianism is not just the view that we are free from external influences. Obviously, external influences do have an impact on us. I just say that, again, the agent makes the ultimate final decision in his set of possible paths. And so I would just, again, go back to my definition of free will, which, again, was the ability over time for an individual to navigate to a type of chooser as a top-down operation. So that definition is the one Peter Tyson uses, and it kind of combines free will and meta free will. And I do think once you look into it, I think I'm not really sure how that would conflict with the PSR. But again, I'm still new to this thing. So I could be wrong about the PSR. Jacob could be totally right here about the PSR. I don't know. I'm still new to philosophy. I've only been doing this for a few years. So yeah, but that's all I got to say about that.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we thank you so much for coming on here and give us this. I mean, we got a lot to think about. I know this is I know it stimulated my brain here, but yeah, and also want to say to Titus, you missed a good one, man. Titus is another co-host we have here, and he's working on another project right now. But again, guys, thank you so much. That's it for this edition of Proselytize or Apostatize. Again, thanks, guys, for coming.
Thank you.